Hideki Tojo, the executioner of Asia. Hideki Tojo, 1884–1948, was Japan's prime minister during World War II and one of the chief architects of Japanese militarism. He is remembered as the embodiment of brutality, transforming Japan into a war machine that spread terror across Asia. The man behind the invasion of China. Hideki Tojo was one of the most uncompromising advocates of Japan's imperial expansion during the first half of the 20th century. As both a military leader and later Prime Minister of Japan, he embodied the militant ideology that believed the Japanese Empire had a divine mission to dominate Asia through force, conquest, and subjugation. Tojo was not simply a bureaucrat following orders, he was a driving force who actively encouraged aggression, the suppression of dissent, and the ruthless exploitation of conquered territories. His policies laid the groundwork for some of the darkest chapters in modern Asian history, none more infamous than the invasion of China and the subsequent atrocities committed during the Nanjing Massacre of 1937. The invasion of China was not a sudden decision but the culmination of years of militarist ambition. Tojo and his contemporaries viewed China as both a threat and an opportunity. A vast land of resources, manpower, and markets, yet also a fractured nation weakened by internal strife. In their eyes, China's vulnerability made it the perfect target for Japan's expansionist dreams. Tojo's advocacy for aggressive military campaigns aligned perfectly with the prevailing nationalist sentiment within the Japanese army, which saw conquest as not only inevitable but necessary for Japan's survival as a rising power. He pressed relentlessly for decisive military action, ignoring diplomacy and dismissing voices of moderation within Japan. When Japanese troops entered Nanjing, the capital of the Republic of China at that time, the city quickly descended into a nightmare of unimaginable violence. What unfolded over the course of 6 harrowing weeks became one of the most infamous war crimes of the 20th century. Conservative estimates put the death toll at around 200,000, while many scholars and survivors have documented figures exceeding 300,000. These were not casualties of battle, but unarmed civilians and surrendered soldiers who were slaughtered in cold blood. The massacre represented the systematic breakdown of all humanity, with soldiers turning the city into a theater of cruelty and barbarity. Accounts from survivors, journalists, and even some horrified Japanese witnesses described scenes of unparalleled horror. Thousands of men were rounded up and executed en masse, lined up along riverbanks, shot, bayonet, or buried alive. Entire groups of prisoners of war, who under international law should have been protected, were instead treated as expendable. Japanese troops carried out executions with chilling efficiency, as if taking part in a grotesque competition to see who could kill the fastest or the most. Children were not spared. Babies were bayoneted in front of their mothers. Young boys were shot or beaten to death simply to eliminate future enemies. The elderly, too weak to flee, were slaughtered without mercy. Homes were looted and burned, families torn apart, and an ancient city with centuries of culture was reduced to a smoldering ruin. The name Nanjing became synonymous with human suffering on an almost unimaginable scale, a place where morality collapsed and where cruelty became the norm. Foreign witnesses, including missionaries, journalists, and diplomats, recorded the atrocities in grim detail. The so-called Nanking Safety Zone, established by a group of Westerners, managed to shelter tens of thousands of civilians. Their diaries and reports remain some of the most damning evidence of the crimes committed. One of the most famous testimonies came from John Rabe, a German businessman and Nazi Party member who, ironically, used his political status to save countless Chinese lives. His records describe daily massacres, bodies piled in the streets, and rivers clogged with corpses. These accounts ensured that the world could never forget what had taken place. Tojo, though not physically present in Nanjing, bore immense responsibility. As a senior military leader in the late 1930s and later the central architect of Japan's war strategy, his policies created the environment that encouraged brutality and rewarded aggression. He promoted an ideology that glorified violence, dehumanized enemies, and demanded absolute obedience. In this climate, atrocities were not aberrations but the natural consequence of policies that stripped away morality in the name of empire. Tojo's insistence on expanding the war at any cost meant that human life, especially that of conquered peoples, was seen as expendable. The legacy of Nanjing haunted the post-war world. When Japan was defeated in 1945, Tojo was among the most prominent figures held accountable during the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, often referred to as the Tokyo Trials. Charged with waging wars of aggression and with responsibility for the atrocities committed under his leadership, Tojo was found guilty and sentenced to death. In 1948, he was executed by hanging, a grim end for the man who had once envisioned himself as the architect of a new Asian order. Yet for millions of victims and their families, his punishment could never erase the horrors unleashed by his policies. The Nanjing Massacre remains a painful memory not only for China but for the world. It stands as a chilling reminder of how unchecked militarism and fanatic nationalism can lead to unimaginable cruelty. Tojo's role in enabling and legitimizing such violence makes him one of history's most reviled figures. While some revisionists in Japan have attempted to downplay or deny the atrocities, the overwhelming weight of evidence ensures that the truth cannot be buried. The city of Nanjing itself, now modern and vibrant, continues to honor the memory of those who suffered through memorials, museums, and education. The importance of remembering Nanjing is not just historical. It is moral. The massacre serves as a warning of what happens when leaders place ideology above humanity, when conquest is valued more than compassion, and when power is pursued without restraint. Tojo's ambition for dominance created a legacy of suffering that reverberates to this day, shaping the relations between nations and reminding the world of the fragility of civilization when confronted with unchecked violence. Ultimately, Tojo's name is inseparable from the tragedy of Nanjing. The atrocities committed under his watch revealed the darkest side of human nature, amplified by ideology and militarism. The massacre was not an accident of war but the direct result of policies and decisions made by those in power. By examining his role, history underscores the responsibility of leaders to protect human life, to restrain violence, and to recognize the humanity even in their enemies. The story of Nanjing, and Tojo's central role in it, is a solemn lesson for all generations, that war without morality leads only to destruction, and that the memory of victims must never be silenced. Brutality toward Asian civilians. The cruelty unleashed under Hideki Tojo's leadership did not end with the invasion of China or the infamous massacre at Nanjing. As the Japanese Empire pushed deeper into Southeast Asia and the Pacific during World War II, the suffering of civilians multiplied on an almost unimaginable scale. Tojo, both as a senior military strategist and eventually as prime minister, directly oversaw and approved campaigns that extended Japan's grip across vast swaths of Asia, from Burma and Malaya to the Philippines, Indonesia, and beyond. In each territory the Imperial Army occupied, civilians bore the brunt of militarist policies that treated conquered peoples as expendable resources to be exploited for the war effort. One of the most notorious legacies of this occupation was the forced labor system, often referred to as slave labor. Men, women, and even children were conscripted at gunpoint, torn from their families, and made to toil under unbearable conditions. In Burma and Thailand, tens of thousands of civilians were forced to build the infamous Burma-Thailand Railway, also known as the Death Railway. Construction demanded cutting through dense jungles, blasting through mountains, and bridging turbulent rivers, all with primitive tools and without proper medical care or food. Prisoners and civilians alike worked from dawn until nightfall in sweltering heat and monsoon rains, weakened by malnutrition and disease. The Japanese officers driving the project cared only for speed, not human life. Those too weak to continue were beaten, executed, or simply left to die. It is estimated that over 100,000 laborers, Burmese, Thai, Malay, Chinese, Javanese, and others, perished during the construction, alongside more than 12,000 Allied prisoners of war. But the Death Railway was only one example of Tojo's policies of exploitation. Across the occupied territories, civilians were conscripted to dig underground tunnels, construct airfields, build roads, and haul supplies. Entire villages were rounded up, with men forced into work battalions while women were subjected to sexual slavery in the form of the so-called comfort women system. This network of coercion, endorsed by the Japanese High Command, reduced human beings to mere instruments of war. Starvation rations, brutal discipline, and the constant threat of beatings or execution ensured that resistance was nearly impossible. The scale of death was staggering. Historians estimate that millions across Asia perished not directly from combat but from famine, forced labor, untreated disease, and systematic abuse. In Vietnam, the requisitioning of rice by the Japanese army, combined with mismanagement and natural disasters, triggered a famine in 1944 to 1945 that killed between 1 and 2 million people. In Indonesia, then known as the Dutch East Indies, forced agricultural policies and labor conscription, known locally as Ramusha, led to the deaths of an estimated 4 million civilians. In the Philippines, mass executions and scorched earth tactics left entire communities devastated. Everywhere the Japanese army advanced, Tojo's militarist doctrine justified cruelty as a necessary tool to secure victory and maintain control. The suffering was not limited to civilians. Prisoners of war captured by the Japanese endured conditions so horrific that they became infamous worldwide. Allied soldiers from Britain, Australia, the Netherlands, and the United States who fell into Japanese hands were crammed into overcrowded, unsanitary camps where disease spread unchecked. Food was scarce, medical supplies almost non-existent, and punishments for even minor infractions were savage. Prisoners were beaten with rifle butts, subjected to water torture, and forced into grueling labor despite injuries or illness. Survival often depended on sheer luck, as death from starvation, cholera, malaria, or exhaustion was a daily reality. Some camps recorded death rates of 30 to 40%, figures that underline the systemic cruelty embedded in Japan's war machine under Tojo's oversight. One of the most chilling aspects of these prison camps was the deliberate policy of neglect. Tojo's government refused to recognize the Geneva Conventions regarding the treatment of prisoners, dismissing them as Western ideas incompatible with Japan's militarist ethos. Instead, prisoners were seen as dishonored individuals unworthy of humane treatment. This ideology translated into a complete disregard for their lives, and thousands were worked or starved to death. Survivors later testified that they were reduced to skeletons, covered in sores, and haunted by the screams of fellow captives being tortured. Their accounts remain some of the most damning evidence against the Japanese leadership at post-war tribunals. The brutality extended even further. In Malaya and Singapore, massacres of Chinese civilians suspected of harboring anti-Japanese sentiments became routine. In what came to be known as the Suk-Ching massacres of 1942, tens of thousands of Chinese men were systematically executed. Rounded up in public squares, taken to remote beaches or quarries, and shot, bayonet, or buried alive, these civilians had committed no crime other than belonging to a community suspected of resisting Japanese rule. Tojo's policies encouraged such cleansing operations as necessary for pacifying occupied territories, cementing his reputation as one of the principal architects of terror in Asia. In Burma, the occupation disrupted entire societies. Villages were burned in reprisals against guerrilla resistance. Civilians were used as human shields or forced to carry supplies for Japanese troops through treacherous terrain. Many died on these marches, their bodies abandoned along jungle paths. The sheer indifference to human suffering reflected the ideology drilled into the imperial army, an ideology that emanated from leaders like Tojo, who demanded absolute victory regardless of cost. Perhaps one of the darkest legacies of Tojo's policies was the institutionalization of sexual slavery. Across the empire, tens of thousands of women from Korea, China, the Philippines, Indonesia, Burma, and other nations were forced into comfort stations, where they endured repeated rape by Japanese soldiers. This system was organized, regulated, and justified by the Japanese military hierarchy, with Tojo as one of the key figures approving its continuation. For the women trapped within it, daily life was a cycle of violation, abuse, and despair. Many did not survive the war, others emerged traumatized, their stories suppressed for decades. It was only much later that international awareness of the comfort women system revealed the full scope of this atrocity, cementing Tojo's role in one of the most egregious violations of human rights in modern history. The cumulative impact of these policies was catastrophic. From the rice fields of Vietnam to the jungles of Burma, from the islands of the Philippines to the heartlands of Malaya and Indonesia, Asia became a continent scarred by famine, forced labor, mass executions, and sexual violence. Unlike conventional battles fought between armies, the suffering inflicted by Tojo's Japan targeted the very fabric of civilian society. Millions who had never carried a weapon found themselves enslaved, starved, or slaughtered simply because they lived under occupation. After Japan's defeat in 1945, the evidence of these crimes could no longer be hidden. Testimonies from survivors, reports by Allied investigators, and photographs smuggled out of occupied territories revealed the enormity of the suffering. At the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, Tojo faced charges not only for waging aggressive war but also for his complicity in crimes against humanity. Witness after witness described the horrors of forced labor camps, the brutality of the death railway, the torment of prison camps, and the devastation of entire communities. The tribunal concluded that these atrocities were not the work of rogue soldiers but the consequence of deliberate policies approved and enforced by leaders like Tojo. Even in death, Tojo's shadow lingers over Asia. Monuments and memorials across Southeast Asia testify to the scale of the suffering. In Kanchanaburi, Thailand, graves of thousands of laborers and prisoners lie beneath the tropical sun, silent witnesses to the death railway. In Vietnam, memories of the wartime famine remain woven into the nation's historical consciousness. In Singapore, survivors of the Suk Ching massacres pass their testimonies on to future generations. For the women who were once comfort women, their struggle for recognition and justice continues, echoing across international courts and public debates. Tojo's brutality toward Asian civilians reveals the true face of imperialism unchecked by morality. While his name is often remembered in connection with Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor or its campaigns in China, it is in Southeast Asia that his policies destroyed millions of innocent lives. The suffering of these civilians, starved, beaten, enslaved, and executed, was not collateral damage but a central feature of Japan's wartime system. By treating human beings as disposable, Tojo oversaw a reign of terror that scarred the region for generations. The story of Tojo's campaigns in Southeast Asia is therefore not only a historical account but also a moral warning. It reminds us that when leaders embrace conquest without compassion, ideology without humanity, and power without restraint, the result is devastation on a continental scale. The millions of nameless victims, farmers, laborers, prisoners, women, and children, stand as a testament to the cost of Tojo's ambition. Their voices, though silenced by war, endure through memory, testimony, and history. Responsibility for an entire war machine. Hideki Tojo's legacy is not confined to a handful of battlefield orders or isolated acts of cruelty. His true responsibility lies in his role as the architect, administrator, and apologist for a war machine that consumed millions of lives across Asia and the Pacific. Unlike many military leaders who sought only tactical victories, Tojo envisioned and defended a total system of conquest in which human suffering was not an accidental byproduct but an accepted, even necessary, cost. He rose to power not simply as a soldier executing commands from above, but as a relentless ideologue who gave moral, political, and strategic justification to Japan's descent into aggression. From the moment he assumed positions of leadership in the 1930s, Tojo consistently argued that Japan's survival depended on the subjugation of its neighbors. He framed imperial expansion as a matter of destiny, insisting that the Japanese people had a divine mandate to dominate Asia. To him, war was not a tragedy to be avoided but a tool of policy, a cleansing fire that would both secure resources and cement Japan's place as a global power. In speeches, cabinet meetings, and military councils, Tojo dismissed peace negotiations as weakness and portrayed the killing of enemies, soldiers and civilians alike, as necessary sacrifices. By doing so, he offered not only orders but also the ideological framework that gave those orders legitimacy in the eyes of his subordinates. This ideological leadership was critical. Japan in the early 20th century was already moving toward militarism, but it was Tojo who translated vague nationalist aspirations into concrete policies. Under his authority, Japan abandoned any pretense of respecting international law. Treaties were disregarded, conventions on the treatment of prisoners ignored, and humanitarian principles derided as Western inventions. Instead, Tojo promoted a ruthless ethic, obedience to the emperor, total mobilization of society, and absolute disregard for the rights of conquered peoples. By embedding this ethos into the structure of the state, he ensured that atrocities were not isolated acts of cruelty but systematic outcomes of policy. The Japanese war machine under Tojo became a vast and intricate apparatus, stretching from the highest echelons of government to the most remote village in occupied Asia. Factories in Japan churned out weapons using materials extracted from colonies seized at gunpoint. Railways and shipping lines were redirected to funnel resources back to the home islands, often at the expense of starving local populations. Armies marched under banners of imperial destiny, leaving behind a trail of devastation. In every instance, Tojo's fingerprints were visible, not necessarily in direct commands to commit specific atrocities, but in the policies that demanded endless expansion, endless labor, and endless sacrifice. Tojo's personal involvement was unmistakable. As Minister of War, then later as Prime Minister during the height of World War II, he wielded enormous influence over both strategy and ideology. His speeches to the Japanese people consistently emphasized the necessity of sacrifice, framing the war as an existential struggle that justified every cruelty. He defended the bombing of civilian populations, the forced labor of millions, and the use of starvation as a weapon. Tojo's genius, if it can be called that, lay in his ability to transform barbarity into policy and to present it as patriotic duty. One of the most chilling aspects of Tojo's leadership was his insistence on the inevitability of death. In his worldview, soldiers who died for the emperor achieved ultimate honor, and civilians who perished in occupied territories were merely collateral in the grand project of empire. He dismissed international outrage as propaganda and doubled down on Japan's right to pursue conquest by any means. By repeating these ideas in government meetings, military briefings, and radio broadcasts, Tojo normalized atrocity. His words gave cover to officers and soldiers who might otherwise have hesitated, convincing them that cruelty was not only permissible but essential. The machinery of war under Tojo consumed entire nations. In China, millions perished through famine, massacres, and forced labor. In Southeast Asia, whole populations were dragged into the nightmare of the death railway or forced into agricultural slavery. In the Pacific, island communities were uprooted, exploited, or obliterated. The sheer scale of suffering defies imagination. Yet Tojo continued to insist that such losses were required for Japan's survival, portraying them as part of a grand historical mission. His responsibility, therefore, cannot be measured solely in the direct orders he gave, but in the ideology and policies that turned the Japanese state into a machine of systematic destruction. The structure of that machine reveals just how deeply Tojo's influence penetrated. At the top were the government ministries, dominated by militarists who owed loyalty to Tojo. Below them, the armed forces enforced his directives with ruthless efficiency. Industrialists collaborated by exploiting resources and workers, often under compulsion but also out of profit motive. Propaganda organs glorified death in battle, silenced dissent, and indoctrinated children with militarist slogans. Even schools became part of the machinery, teaching students that dying for the emperor was the highest honor. Every cog in this system turned according to Tojo's design, ensuring that cruelty was not an accident but a constant, predictable result. The most damning evidence of Tojo's responsibility lies in his role as both commander and apologist. Unlike leaders who later claimed ignorance, Tojo openly defended Japan's policies before and after the war. When confronted with reports of atrocities, he insisted that such actions were necessary measures, taken in the heat of battle. When accused of violating international law, he retorted that Japan had its own moral code, superior to Western principles. In doing so, he transformed the Japanese war machine from a collection of brutal acts into a self-justifying system. His words gave coherence to violence, turning murder into strategy and atrocity into policy. The human cost of this system was staggering. Millions of Chinese civilians perished through massacres, famine, and forced labor. In Korea, families were torn apart as men were conscripted and women forced into sexual slavery. In Southeast Asia, farmers starved as rice was requisitioned for the Japanese army, while laborers died building roads, tunnels, and railways. Prisoners of war wasted away in camps where neglect was official policy. Even in Japan itself, ordinary citizens endured crushing shortages, constant propaganda, and the suppression of dissent. The war machine Tojo built did not distinguish between enemy and subject, between foreigner and Japanese. It demanded sacrifice from all, and it devoured those who could not keep pace. At the end of the war, when Japan stood in ruins, Tojo attempted to accept responsibility in a final act of self-preservation. He tried to take his own life before capture, but survived. At the Tokyo trials, he defended his actions with the same arguments he had used during the war, that conquest was necessary, that atrocities were unavoidable, that Japan had acted in self-defense. Yet the evidence against him was overwhelming. Witnesses, documents, and survivors' testimonies demonstrated that Tojo had not merely been a soldier following orders but a leader who created, justified, and perpetuated a system of inhumanity. The tribunal judged him guilty, and he was sentenced to death. Even after his execution in 1948, the shadow of Tojo's war machine lingered. Nations across Asia remembered the devastation. Memorials, mass graves, and survivor testimonies bore witness to the suffering inflicted under his policies. In China, Nanjing remains a symbol of unhealed wounds. In Korea, the plight of the comfort women continues to shape public memory. In Southeast Asia, the legacy of forced labor and famine is woven into national histories. Tojo's name has become synonymous not only with aggression but with the machinery of dehumanization that turned an entire empire into an engine of destruction. Tojo's responsibility is therefore not limited to the crimes of individuals but extends to the creation of a system that normalized violence. He was the designer of an ideology that erased compassion, the administrator of policies that exploited millions, and the apologist who gave moral cover to atrocity. His war machine was not a faceless abstraction but a structure with his fingerprints on every level, from high strategy to the daily suffering of ordinary people. By insisting that killing was necessary, he stripped human life of its sanctity and replaced it with a calculus of empire. In the end, Hideki Tojo stands as a grim reminder of how a single leader can shape the destiny of nations through ideology as much as through force. His responsibility is measured not only in the orders he gave but in the millions of lives destroyed by the machinery he built and justified. The Japanese war machine was vast, but at its heart stood a man who believed that survival required cruelty, and that conquest excused atrocity. History has judged him harshly, and rightly so, for he bore responsibility for an empire of suffering that stretched across continents and generations. Collapse and punishment. The end of World War II marked the collapse of the Japanese Empire and, with it, the fall of Hideki Tojo, the man who had symbolized Japan's unyielding militarism. By 1945, Japan's dream of dominating Asia had disintegrated into rubble. Cities such as Tokyo, Osaka, and Hiroshima lay in ruins after relentless firebombing and the atomic bombings that shocked the world. Millions of Japanese civilians were displaced, starving, or grieving the dead. The empire that Tojo had insisted would last for generations had collapsed within a few short years. Amid this devastation, Tojo himself became the embodiment of responsibility for the catastrophe, the man upon whose shoulders the burden of war crimes and aggression was placed. As Allied forces occupied Japan, Tojo attempted to evade justice. When American soldiers arrived at his home in September 1945 to arrest him, he shot himself in the chest with a pistol in an apparent suicide attempt. However, fate denied him the release he sought. The bullet missed his heart, and after a chaotic scene in which doctors and journalists swarmed the house, he was rushed to a U.S. Army hospital where his wounds were treated. His survival was described by some as ironic justice. The man who had ordered millions to their deaths would not be permitted to escape accountability through his own hand. In the months that followed, Tojo was prepared to face what the world had in store for him. The Allies had decided that Japan's leaders, like those of Nazi Germany, would not be allowed to fade quietly into obscurity. They would stand trial for their crimes in an international tribunal that came to be known as the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, IMTFE, or more commonly, the Tokyo Trials. Modeled on the Nuremberg trials in Europe, the Tokyo Tribunal was designed to bring justice for the atrocities committed across Asia during Japan's wars of aggression. Tojo's place at the center of the proceedings was inevitable. As both Prime Minister and War Minister during Japan's most aggressive campaigns, he embodied the militarist ideology that had driven the empire. He was indicted on multiple counts, waging wars of aggression, violating international law, and, most damningly, crimes against humanity. These charges reflected the vast suffering caused under his leadership: massacres in China, forced labor across Southeast Asia, the abuse of prisoners of war, and the systematic use of sexual slavery. The courtroom became a stage where the horrors of war were recounted, and Tojo, seated before the judges, was forced to confront evidence of the system he had built. During the trial, Tojo presented himself as a man of discipline and obedience. He attempted to shoulder responsibility in a manner that portrayed him as a loyal servant of the emperor rather than an architect of war. He admitted Japan's defeat, expressed regret for the suffering caused, and even took personal blame for decisions that led to disaster. But he also defended the ideology of Japan's expansion, insisting that the nation had acted out of necessity and self-defense. His testimony revealed the same contradictions that had defined his leadership: an admission of personal failure combined with a stubborn refusal to acknowledge the immorality of the war itself. The trial stretched on for more than 2 years, involving thousands of documents, hundreds of witnesses, and testimonies from survivors across Asia. Accounts of the Nanjing Massacre, the Death Railway, the starvation of prisoners, and the exploitation of entire nations were laid out in detail. For the first time, the global public was exposed to the full extent of Japan's wartime atrocities. The evidence was overwhelming, and though Tojo's defense attorneys argued passionately, they could not erase the reality of millions of victims. In November 1948, the tribunal delivered its verdict. Hideki Tojo was found guilty on multiple counts, including waging aggressive war and responsibility for crimes against humanity. The judges sentenced him to death. Unlike in Europe, where leading Nazis were hanged, the method of execution in Tokyo was by hanging as well, though some sources initially reported it as a firing squad due to translation errors. Regardless of method, the symbolism was the same: the world had judged him and found him guilty of unleashing destruction and cruelty on a massive scale. On December 23, 1948, Tojo faced his end. In the early hours of the morning, he was led to the gallows at Sugamo prison in Tokyo, along with 6 other condemned war leaders. Witnesses described him as calm, even stoic, as he mounted the steps. In his final words, he praised the emperor and expressed loyalty to Japan, clinging to the ideology that had guided his life to the very end. Moments later, the trapdoor opened, and the man once feared as the iron fist of Japan's empire was gone. The execution of Tojo and his fellow war criminals was not merely a punishment for individual acts, it was intended as a symbolic cleansing, a declaration that militarism had brought ruin and would no longer dominate Japan. For the victims across Asia, it represented at least some measure of justice, though no sentence could undo the suffering inflicted. For the Japanese people themselves, it was a sobering reminder of the cost of blind obedience to destructive leaders. In the years that followed, Tojo's legacy remained deeply controversial. Some in Japan mourned him as a patriot who had fought for his nation, while others condemned him as the architect of unnecessary wars and human suffering. Shrines that honored the war dead, such as Yasukuni, became sites of political conflict whenever Tojo's name was included among the enshrined. In neighboring countries like China and Korea, his memory became a symbol of wartime cruelty, a name associated with massacre, exploitation, and brutality. The punishment of Tojo also had profound implications for international justice. The Tokyo trials, though criticized for victors' justice and political bias, established important precedents in holding leaders accountable for crimes against humanity. They demonstrated that war was not merely a contest of armies but a system in which leaders could be held responsible for the suffering of civilians and prisoners. In this sense, Tojo's conviction and execution became part of a broader movement toward global standards of justice, one that continues to resonate in later tribunals and international courts. Tojo's downfall, then, was more than the fall of a man, it was the collapse of an entire ideology. The empire he had glorified was dismantled. The military he had championed was disbanded. Japan was rebuilt under a new constitution that renounced war. And Tojo himself, once the most powerful man in Asia, ended his life swinging from a rope, condemned by history. His story remains a stark lesson in the dangers of unchecked militarism, of leaders who justify atrocities in the name of survival, and of the terrible cost paid when ideology triumphs over humanity. Today, when one speaks of Hideki Tojo, it is rarely as a statesman or strategist but as a war criminal, a man whose name is forever tied to destruction. His execution did not erase the suffering of millions, but it did ensure that he would stand in history as an example of accountability. The collapse of Japan's empire and the punishment of its leaders remind the world that no amount of power or ideology can shield those who unleash cruelty on such a scale. In the ruins of 1945 and the gallows of 1948, the judgment was clear: the machinery of death and conquest that Tojo represented had no place in the future. His legacy stands as a grim reminder that when power and extremism eclipse humanity, the price to be paid is the suffering of all humankind.